In the heart of ancient Sweden, where pine forests stretch endlessly to the horizon and icy rivers carve their way through the land, there lies a place of legend. A place where kings once knelt before the gods, where blood was spilled for power, and where a throne stood, a throne whose shadow still stretches across 1,000 years of history. This is Uppsala. Not the city you see on a map today, but the old Uppsala, a sacred seat of power, a cradle of mystery, and the home of a forgotten throne. To understand Uppsala, we must first understand the world from which it rose. The Viking Age was not merely an age of warriors and raiders. It was an age of kingdoms taking shape, of gods still walking among mortals in the minds of men. In the north, the climate was harsh, the winters long, and life demanded both resilience and reverence. Here, the people of the Sphere, an ancient tribe of Sweden, built their lives upon the soil, the sea, and their gods. They saw the divine not in distant heavens but in the wind, the stone, the thunder above and the roots of the earth below. This world was divided not by walls and borders but by honor, kinship, and power. Chieftains rose, jarls ruled, and above them all, kings sought legitimacy. But a king was nothing without the blessing of the gods, and in the north there was no holier place to seek that blessing than Uppsala. Old Uppsala sits about 5 kilometers north of the modern city. Today you see rolling mounds of grass and earth, quiet, serene, almost ordinary. But 1,000 years ago, this was the beating heart of Scandinavian spirituality and kingship. Travelers spoke of a great temple, glittering with gold, surrounded by sacred groves where sacrifices were made. They spoke of kings ascending to a throne not merely to rule men but to commune with gods. What we know of Uppsala comes from 2 sources: the ground beneath our feet and the sagas carried by words. The earth has given us burial mounds, 3 great ones said to be the resting places of ancient kings, perhaps even gods themselves. The stories tell us of a throne, a seat of authority, a place where the ruler of the sphere was crowned and consecrated. In Norse society, kings were not just political leaders. They were sacred intermediaries, guardians of prosperity, bringers of fertility and victory. Their power was bound to ritual. Each spring, each harvest, each war, all were touched by the gods. And at Uppsala, the throne symbolized this union of the earthly and the divine. To sit upon it was not just to command armies, but to hold the fate of the land itself. Here, sacrifices were offered, animals, wealth, and, if the stories are true, even humans. For to fail the gods was to fail the people, and a king's power was only as strong as the blessings he could secure. This was not a throne of comfort. It was a throne of obligation, blood, and fear. The Christian chronicler Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, described the Temple of Uppsala as one of the wonders of the north. He claimed its walls were covered in gold and that within it stood statues of 3 great gods, Thor in the center, Odin on one side and Freyr on the other. Before them burned an eternal fire. Around the temple, a sacred grove grew so thick and ancient that the trees themselves seemed to hum with life. And in that grove hung sacrifices, men and animals alike, their bodies offered to ensure the favor of the gods. To modern eyes, such tales are chilling. But to the people of the north, they were acts of devotion, of necessity. In the shadow of the throne, these rituals bound the community together. Power, after all, was not just taken, it was granted by the unseen forces that ruled the world. But what of the throne? Unlike the temple, no physical throne has been uncovered at Uppsala. No gilded seat sits in a museum. Its existence lives in legend, pieced together from hints in the sagas and the accounts of foreign visitors. Was it carved of wood, decorated with gold? Was it a raised platform, a mound from which kings spoke to their people? Or was it not a chair at all but a metaphor, a sacred place where the king became more than a man? Some archaeologists believe the throne was symbolic, a seat within the temple or on the great mound from which the king presided over rituals. Others suggest the burial mounds themselves were thrones of earth, raised monuments of authority. In any case, the throne of Uppsala was more than furniture. It was an idea, the nexus of power, faith, and destiny. North of the temple rise 3 enormous mounds, each more than 10 meters high. For centuries they have been called the royal mounds, believed to hold the remains of legendary kings. In later folklore they were said to be the burial places of Odin, Thor, and Freyr themselves. Modern excavations suggest they indeed contain burials, chieftains or kings from the 6th century, but the full truth remains elusive. Standing atop these mounds today, one can see the sweep of the land, the rivers glinting in the distance, the fields stretching toward the horizon. It is easy to imagine a king standing here, cloaked in fur, a crown of iron on his brow, his voice rising over the crowd. This was no ordinary seat of power. This was the throne of a people and their gods. In a world where writing was rare, symbols mattered. The throne of Uppsala was a living symbol, a stage for the drama of kingship. Here, the king demonstrated his right to rule, received the oaths of his warriors, and performed the sacrifices that bound the land to the gods. Without this ritual center, a king's power was merely force. With it, his power became destiny. This is why Uppsala stood apart. It was not just another hall or settlement. It was the axis of the world for the sphere where heaven and earth touched. And at its heart, the throne waited. This is the beginning of our journey into the forgotten throne of Uppsala. In the next chapter we will step closer to its rituals, its kings, and the great temple where the line between myth and reality blurs. We will walk among the sacrifices, stand beside the golden statues, and try to glimpse the power that once emanated from this sacred seat. For if history remembers the Vikings as warriors, Uppsala remembers them as something else, as seekers of power beyond the sword. In the hush of dawn, as mist clings to the low fields around old Uppsala, it is not hard to imagine the drums. Slow, deep, steady. The kind of sound that rolls across a crowd, that makes your heartbeat match its rhythm. In this sacred place, the air itself once trembled with ceremony. Men and women gathered in long cloaks of wool and fur, warriors with their weapons left outside, priests with their faces painted in strange patterns. In the center stood the king, not as a man above others but as the vessel of the god's will. All eyes on him, all lives bound to the choices he would make, and to the power he might summon from the unseen world. This was the true weight of the throne at Uppsala. Rituals were the lifeblood of this place. The people of the north believed the gods demanded not only words but actions, offerings, and sacrifice. The crops had to grow, the winters had to be survived, the wars had to be won. Without divine favor, even the strongest kingdom would crumble into famine and rebellion. And so, at Uppsala the king performed his duty. Animals were led to the altar, their throats cut with a single stroke, their blood collected and sprinkled on the sacred posts, the crowd, and the earth itself. Horses, boars, and oxen were given in this way, their deaths seen not as cruelty but as the price of life for the community. The air would fill with the smell of blood, pine, and smoke, a mixture of the earthly and the sacred. But the stories tell of more. Some speak of human sacrifices, of slaves, prisoners of war, or even volunteers chosen to die so that the gods might grant victory or prosperity. Adam of Bremen wrote of men hung in the sacred grove, their bodies swaying among the trees like grim fruit. Whether these accounts are exaggerated by a Christian chronicler eager to shock his audience or accurate descriptions of pagan rites, we may never know. Yet the power of the image endures. The grove at Uppsala was more than trees, it was a living temple without walls, a space where the line between life and death thinned. At the center of it all stood the king, not only as a ruler but as the high priest of his people. In other lands a king might be crowned in a church or a hall, but at Uppsala he was consecrated under the open sky, in the sight of gods and men alike. The throne here was not a cushioned chair of state but a burden. Every decision, every ritual, every war launched from this place was a gamble taken on behalf of thousands. If the harvest failed, if the war went badly, it was the king's fault, not merely politically but spiritually. Some sagas even tell of kings who were sacrificed themselves when times grew desperate, offered up to restore the balance with the divine. Imagine the scene. A winter festival, the Great Blot, 9 days of sacrifices and feasts. The temple glitters with gold by torchlight. Statues of Thor, Odin, and Freyr loom above the gathered crowd. The sacred fire burns hot in the center. Priests chant in the old tongue, their voices rising and falling like waves. Outside, in the grove, the sacrificed hang from the trees, offerings to ensure the turning of the seasons. The king stands at the altar, his hand raised, a figure both feared and revered. To the people he is not simply a man on a throne. He is the link between the earth beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. This is the Uppsala most never see when they think of the Vikings. Not the raiding ships or the long swords, but the heart of their belief, the place where power came not from plunder but from ritual. This was the throne that bound kings to their people, people to their gods, and gods to the fate of the land. Without this sacred center, their world would have been only a collection of farms and halls. With it they were a kingdom. And yet, even here mystery lingers. Was the throne an actual object, hidden now beneath centuries of earth? Was it a golden seat inside the temple, or a carved platform on one of the great mounds? Or was it something else entirely, a ritual place, a mound-shaped stage upon which the king enacted his role? The sagas are unclear, archaeology is silent, and so the throne lives as an idea more than an artifact. Perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps power of this kind is never meant to be contained in wood or stone. In the distance beyond the mounds, the people of the sphere built their homes and fields, lived their lives and waited for the king's rituals to keep the world in balance. They believed that the gods could turn away at any time, that chaos was always near. The throne at Uppsala was their shield against that chaos, as real to them as the longships were to their warriors. It was here that kings made oaths before launching raids, here they asked for victory before battle, here they thanked the gods when the spoils returned. Even the famed raids across the seas began, in a sense, at this throne. When you walk through old Uppsala today, the earth is quiet. The mounds are covered with grass, the grove is gone, the temple long since burned. But if you close your eyes, the air still feels heavy. You can almost hear the chanting, the clash of shields, the low murmur of prayers spoken in the dark. You can almost see the king standing there, crowned not in gold but in obligation, his throne not a seat but a destiny. This was no throne of comfort or of luxury. It was a throne of sacrifice, of blood, of power drawn from forces older and greater than any man. This was the forgotten throne of Uppsala, and even now, in silence, it calls to those who seek the roots of power beyond the sword. They came from the sagas like shadows, names half remembered, deeds half believed. Kings of the sphere, kings of the north, rulers whose lives blurred into myth the moment they were written down. It is here at Uppsala that their footsteps converge. In the long nights around the fire, people whispered their names and the stories of the throne they took. Some were born to it, some seized it, some died upon it, and some were buried beneath it. Foremost among these figures stand the Ynglings, the fabled dynasty whose blood was said to run back to the gods themselves. In the Icelandic sagas, the Yngling kings trace their lineage to Freyr, the god of fertility and peace, who is said to have built his hall at Uppsala and ruled there in an age before memory. To sit on the throne at Uppsala was therefore to sit on a seat that once belonged to a god. Every king who followed claimed that divine spark, invoking it in rituals, inscribing it in stone, echoing it in the sacrifices at the grove. The stories tell of King Inge the Old, who reigned long but grew frail. Desperate to extend his life, he offered up his sons one by one to Odin. 9 sons he sacrificed, and with each life his years lengthened. But when he tried to sacrifice his 10th, the people rebelled. He died not as a god-king but as a man, a cautionary tale about the limits of power even at the sacred throne. Then there was King Domold, whose reign was cursed with famine. Year after year the blot was held, animals sacrificed, wealth offered, but still the earth gave nothing. In the end, the people decided the king himself was the price. Domold was dragged to the altar and killed, his blood spilled to restore fertility to the land. His death became a grim echo of the king's duty at Uppsala, to be the life of the people, even if it meant surrendering his own. Such stories may be legend, but they reveal a truth about the throne. It was not merely a position of privilege. It was a compact, an agreement between ruler, people and gods. The king was expected to rule wisely, to fight bravely, but also to mediate between the human and the divine. When he failed, his throne became an altar. This is power at its most absolute and its most fragile, and Uppsala was the crucible in which it burned. Beyond the Ynglings came others, names like Egils, Onila, and Adils, figures who straddle the boundary between history and poetry. Some appear in the Old English epic Beowulf, their deeds echoing across languages and centuries. In these tales, Uppsala is not just a place but a symbol. It is the high seat of destiny, a throne no one holds forever, a throne that tests those who dare to sit upon it. Archaeology lends a muted voice to these legends. In the great mounds north of the temple, excavators have found ship burials, weapons, ornaments, and the charred remains of feasts and rituals. In one mound, a richly adorned man was buried with his horse, his weapons and the trappings of a king. In another, a woman of high status lay surrounded by treasures. Were these the Yngling kings and queens? Were these the figures from the sagas, at last unearthed from the earth of Uppsala? We do not know. The soil keeps its secrets as tightly as the sagas keep their riddles. And yet, standing there today, the imagination does the rest. One can picture the processions winding up the mounds, banners fluttering in the wind, the king climbing to the top to speak to his people. One can hear the hush before he speaks, the weight of expectation on every breath. This was not a throne hidden in a dark hall. This was a throne under the open sky, visible to all, its rituals a performance and a promise. Even the myths of the gods mirror the kings at Uppsala. Odin hung himself on the world tree to gain wisdom, sacrificing himself to himself. Freyr gave up his sword to win love and thus met his doom. Thor fights the giants knowing he will fall at Ragnarok. These are not tales of unending triumph but of power bound by sacrifice. The throne at Uppsala reflects this mythic pattern. To rule is to give, to risk, to bleed. Power is not a crown of gold but a weight carried on the shoulders. For the people of the North, these stories were not distant allegories. They were warnings and guides, shaping how they saw their rulers and themselves. The king was not above them but among them, chosen to bear the burden of maintaining the cosmic balance. When he succeeded, the land prospered, the harvests grew, the warriors won their battles. When he failed, famine, plague, or defeat followed. And so the throne at Uppsala was as much a test as a privilege, a place where a man's soul was weighed as surely as his deeds. This is why Uppsala was feared as well as revered. It was not just a holy place, it was a dangerous one. To approach its throne was to step into a web of obligations woven by the gods themselves. To take that seat was to accept a bargain older than memory, a bargain written in blood and legend. Even now, with the temple gone and the sacrifices ended, the story of that bargain lingers. It lingers in the sagas, in the mounds, in the very name of Uppsala. It lingers because power, sacrifice, and mystery are themes that never fade, no matter how many centuries pass. The mists of Uppsala did not lift all at once. Change came slowly at first, like a new wind blowing from the south. For centuries, the sacred grove stood, the temple shone, and the throne held its power. But far beyond the forests and fjords, another faith had been rising, a faith of one God, of churches and bishops, of written laws and crosses raised over the bones of the old temples. It crept north along trade routes and along the paths of war, carried by merchants, missionaries, and kings who had already converted. And as it came, it challenged everything Uppsala stood for. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the first Christian missionaries arrived in Sweden. They came from Hamburg, from Bremen, from distant courts where the Pope's word was law. They saw Uppsala as a place of darkness, a last outpost of pagan power that had to be brought into the light. They wrote of it with a mixture of horror and fascination. The gold on the temple walls, the bodies hanging in the sacred grove, the kings who still called upon Odin and Thor instead of Christ. But their words were also weapons. By describing the place as savage, they made the case for its destruction. Even among the kings of Sweden, the old ways were beginning to fray. Some rulers saw advantage in the new faith. To be crowned a Christian king was to be recognized by powerful allies in Europe, to gain legitimacy from the church, to open doors for trade and diplomacy. Slowly, the sacrifices at Uppsala became less frequent. The old priests lost their grip on the court. Crosses began to appear alongside runes. The gods of the temple grew silent, replaced by a god who promised salvation without blood. It was in the reign of King Inge the Elder, in the late 11th century, that the final blow fell. Inge had been raised a Christian but inherited a people still bound to the old rites. When he refused to make sacrifices at Uppsala, he was driven from the throne by a pagan rival. But Inge returned with force, defeating his enemies and burning the temple. The sacred grove was cut down, the gold melted or stolen, the altar stones overturned. The throne of Uppsala, once the seat of kings and gods alike, was gone. In its place rose a church, and then another, and finally a cathedral dedicated to Christ. What happened to the throne itself we do not know. If it was a physical seat, it may have been destroyed or hidden. If it was a mound, it simply became another hill in the landscape. If it was an idea, it vanished into the hearts of the people who could no longer speak its name. All that remains are whispers. The mounds still rise from the earth, the same green shapes they have been for more than 1,000 years. Beneath them lie the bones of kings and horses, weapons and treasures, but no one can say where the throne stood. Yet destruction is never complete. The memory of Uppsala survived in sagas, in place names, in the stories told to children long after the old gods were gone. Even the cathedral built on the site carries the echo of what stood there before. Beneath its stones are layers of older walls, older altars, older prayers. The sacredness of the place did not disappear, it transformed. The kings of Sweden still trace their legitimacy to Uppsala, even if they no longer sacrifice at its grove. The coronations moved to churches, the rituals changed, but the idea of a throne at the heart of the nation endured. For the people who came after, the fall of the old gods was not just the loss of a religion. It was the end of a world. The bond between king and gods, between land and sacrifice, was broken. Power shifted from the sacred to the secular, from the grove to the hall, from the temple to the court. In its place grew a different kind of power, one of written law, of coins, of alliances sealed with marriages rather than blood. The sword did not vanish, but it was no longer sanctified at the throne of Uppsala. And still, if you stand on the mounds at sunset and look out over the fields, it is easy to imagine the moment before the flames. The temple still gleaming, the priest still chanting, the king still holding his hand over the altar. Then the noise of soldiers, the crackle of fire, the smell of burning wood and gold. The old world collapsing into ash, its throne slipping away into legend. Uppsala today is quiet. Tourists walk among the mounds, reading plaques about the kings of old. Children run down the slopes where once warriors processed. A museum holds fragments of ornaments and weapons, but no throne. And yet, for those who know the stories, the place hums with power. It is not the same power as before, but a memory of it, a ghost of the throne that once stood at the center of the north. This is what makes the throne of Uppsala truly forgotten. Not because it is gone, but because it has become invisible. It exists now only in story, in imagination, in the thin line between myth and history. But in that line, it is more alive than ever. The throne has become a question, a riddle. Was it real? Was it only a symbol? Or was it something else entirely, an idea of power that can never be destroyed? Perhaps that is why Uppsala still draws us. Because behind the grass and stones we sense a story about ourselves, about power, about faith, about the price we pay to hold a throne. The gods may have changed, but the mystery remains. And the mystery is what gives the throne its true power, even now, 1,000 years after it vanished from the world. Time passes, but places remember. In Uppsala, the winds that once carried the chants of priests now carry the chatter of visitors. The sacred grove is gone, the temple burned, the throne lost, but the land itself holds a memory deeper than stone. Walk among the burial mounds at dawn, when the mist clings low to the grass and you feel it. Not ghosts exactly, but a presence, a sense that here power and faith once touched the earth in ways we can barely imagine. Archaeologists still dig, brushing earth from rusted swords and broken beads, mapping out long-buried halls and forgotten post-holes. Each find adds a thread to the tapestry, but never the whole picture. For every artifact uncovered, another question rises. Was the throne of Uppsala a physical seat, carved and gilded, raised high above the crowds? Or was it simply a ritual place, a mound, a stone, a symbol? Did kings truly sacrifice themselves there, or were those stories only metaphors for a king's duty? What we do know is that Uppsala was more than just a site on a map. It was a center of the Viking world, a heart where religion, politics, and myth met. It was a stage where kings tried to bridge the gap between men and gods, sometimes succeeding, sometimes paying with their lives. It was a living myth, a place where stories were not only told but acted out. And perhaps that is why, even now, the throne of Uppsala still matters. Because thrones are never just chairs. They are ideas. They are promises and burdens, symbols of power and sacrifice. Every society in every age builds its own Uppsala, its own place where authority must be justified, where leaders are tested, where the line between sacred and profane blurs. If you stand today before Uppsala Cathedral, built over the bones of the old temple, and let your mind drift back, you can almost see the overlapping worlds. The cross above and the hammer below, the altar of Christ and the altar of Odin, the echoes of chants rising through time. Beneath your feet, kings and horses still sleep, and perhaps, somewhere deeper still, the throne waits, not destroyed but dreaming. Legends say that in the last days the old gods will return, and the world will end in fire and frost. Maybe that is only a story. Or maybe it is a way of saying that nothing powerful is ever truly lost, only transformed. The throne of Uppsala may be hidden, but it lives on in memory, in myth, in the imagination of everyone who hears its name. And so, as we leave this place, we do not leave empty-handed. We carry with us a story of a forgotten throne, of kings who were gods and gods who were kings, of sacrifice and power, of a world now gone but still alive in whispers. A story that belongs not just to Sweden, but to all of us who wonder at the thin veil between history and legend. Perhaps one day some new discovery will pierce the veil, a hidden chamber, a forgotten relic, a scrap of text that tells us exactly what stood at the heart of Uppsala. Until then, the throne remains unknown, its mystery unbroken. And maybe that is as it should be. Because a mystery once solved loses its power. And the power of Uppsala has always been its mystery. This is the throne unknown, a seat of kings and gods, a memory of sacrifice and glory, a story still unfolding in the shadows of the north. Here, in the mists of time, the throne of Uppsala still waits, silent and unseen but never forgotten.